Hello and welcome to episode 24 of the Actual Magician's Bookshelf. Yes, I am an actual magician, where today we are going to be continuing our look at Magick Without Tears by Aleister Crowley, a collection of letters he wrote to a student towards the end of his life. And in our previous video, we took a look at number 64, letter 64 on magical power. So I would ask you to go and take a look at that video, although this one is also standalone to some extent. But we are bridging off letter 64 on magical power that we looked at and read through in our previous session, because Aleister Crowley makes the point, you must lay to heart Magick chapter 14 and never forget one detail on the magical link. More failure comes from neglect of this than from all other causes put together. So he is really saying that chapter 14 of Magick is the most important thing about making magic work. And we have looked at how to make magical spells work in a previous video as well, but this is a bit more of a deep dive into the subject according to Aleister Crowley. So we are going to take a look at Magick chapter 14 in this particular unscripted read through of Magick Without Tears. But we're now moving to Magick chapter 14 on the consecrations, with an account of the nature and nurture of the magical link. And I'd recommend reading this section. It's 13 pages. It's one of the larger sections, but it's also one of the most important things. So first of all, let's just take another look at consecration. We have talked about consecration in writing a simple ritual that we looked at again in a previous video. And in that I did mention about banishing, purification and consecration as the three first and last steps of a magical ritual per se, a magical ceremony. And we're going to widen our definition of what magic actually is. We're going to widen our definition of magical power itself. We're going to widen our definition of our magical universe and living an actual magician's life in this section as well. So Aleister Crowley starts this section. It is about consecration. Consecration is the active dedication of a thing to a single purpose. Consecration is the actual dedication of a thing to a single purpose. That's where he starts this whole thing from. And as we look at Crowley, with all of Crowley's work, we also always have to have two minds while we're thinking about it. We have to be aware that he is talking from a literal perspective, a magical perspective, and perhaps a third mind from a mystical perspective as well. That anything in Crowley can be read on multiple levels. And so when he's talking about when we dedicate a thing to a specific purpose, that could be our magical wand. It could be our magical cup. It could be our magical bell. It could be all sorts of objects that we're using in a ritual itself. But it also applies to ourselves. We consecrate ourself, our intent, our life to a singular purpose, and we carry that out. And also we can read it on a universal level, a mystical level, that the universe itself is dedicated and consecrating itself to a singular act all of the time. And to me, that is knowing itself, is inquiring into the nature of its own existence through separation. And so Crowley goes on to say, he talks about purification. So he says, consecration is the active dedication of a thing to a single purpose. Banishing prevents its use for any other purpose, but it remains inert until it's consecrated. Purification is performed by water, banishing by air, whose weapon is the sword. Consecration is performed by fire, usually symbolized by the holy oil. And again, you can watch a load of YouTube videos, read a load of books, all sorts of things about the correspondences, whether it's right to have fire with the wand and air with the sword, or air with the wand and fire with the sword, and so forth. But that is entirely nothing to do with magic and actual magic. So don't get entrapped into that sort of discussion, that sort of attention. You've got better things to do with your attention than that. So he goes on to say, in most extant magical rituals, most existing magical rituals, the two operations are performed at once, or at least the banishing has the more important place, and greater pains seem to be taken with it. He's particularly here referring to the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram that we've talked about as being part of a magical ritual, comes from the Golden Dawn. But as the student advances to adeptship, the banishing will diminish importance, for it will be no longer so necessary. And this is a really important thing that I want to talk about today with actual magic, the actual magician's life, as opposed to magic as it's presented often and a lot of the times. And I'm using Crowley as my authority to do that, but it's exactly how I've come to see it as well over the last 40 years. So he says, the banishing will diminish in importance because it will be no longer so necessary. The circle of the magician will have been perfected by his habit of magical work, or their habit of magical work. In the truest sense of the word, they will never step outside of the circle during their whole life, because ultimately you make the circle the universe. Your magical circle, living a magical life, is the universe. This is now your workshop. This is now your temple. You might go into an area of your temple that is called a magical temple, but that is just to focus your will, focus your attention for a specific amount of time in order to change things in the wider circle. This is the magical temple. You don't have another temple to work in. This is reality. Existence is your magical temple. In the truest sense of that word, they will never step outside the circle during their whole life. But the consecration, being the application of a positive force, can always be raised to a closer approximation to perfection. And this is what I sometimes refer to by saying we have to make our consciousness, our awareness, more consistent over time, more congruent, and more comprehensive. Our awareness has to be unchanging, it has to be true, and it has to be as wide as possible, as comprehensive. It has to include all things and be all things. So the awareness becomes, in that sense, omnipotent, omnipresent, and whatever the third thing is that go with consistent, comprehensive, and congruent. Omniform, I guess. So confirm this dedication in words, invoking the appropriate God to indwell that pure temple which you have prepared for him or her. Do this with fervour and love, as if to balance the icy detachment which is the proper mental attitude for banishing. And again, we've spoken in a previous video that the positive enthusiasm, energized enthusiasm that we need to make a ritual work is to both want it fully with all of our intent and also at the same time be fully separated, divorced, non-attached to the outcome, to the result, what Crowley called working without lust of result. And that's the hard state to achieve in a ritual, and it's even harder to achieve in the actual ritual that is your whole life. To be fully dedicated to intent and performance, and at the same time to be non-attached to it as well, exist in what Austin Spare called the neither state. But I'd actually argue against Austin Spare's viewpoint in that regard and say it's actually a everything state, always state, not a neither state, which is just a technical matter, I guess. So that is basically Crowley saying about consecration. And you'd think it would be about, like in all of the other magic books, about how do you consecrate your magical wand? How do you consecrate your Wiccan temple? How do you consecrate this, that, or the other? But Crowley is taking it way further. And as we saw in his letter towards the end of his life in Magick Without Tears, he again is reminding the student, that this is the most important thing out of all of the magical acts. So he goes on to say, it is a strange circumstance, as we briefly touched on in our previous video, that no magical writer has hitherto, or since to some extent, treated the immensely important subject of the magical link. It might almost be called the missing link, he jokes. And he says that it has apparently always been taken for granted. Only lay writers on magic like J.G. Fraser have accorded the subject its full importance. So, in order to look at what the magical link actually is, let's set our terms out in terms of our experiment. What is a magical operation? Crowley says, what is a magical operation? It may be defined as any event in nature which is brought to pass by will. We must not exclude potato growing or banking from our definition. And he goes on to take a really silly example of blowing your nose as a magical operation. But he then makes a slightly serious point, but unless the link is made by the use of his nerves and muscles in accordance with psychological, physiological and physical law, the nose will remain unblown through all eternity. Writers on magic have been unsparing in their efforts to instruct us in the preparation of will, but they seem to have imagined that no further precaution was necessary. And he talks about an epidemic of error, which he talks about mental healing, and matter is an illusion created by will through mind and consequently susceptible of alteration. But the practice has been lacking. They have not developed a scientific technique for applying the will. It is he says, it is as if they expected the steam of Watt's kettle to convey people from place to place without the trouble of inventing and using locomotives, or even using an existing train system that might be in place to get from one place to another. So he then singles out Goetia, which I think is so timely, as I see all of the videos about Goetia and Goetian spirits and working the Qliphoth and the left-hand path and the dark side of the tree of life and so forth. But he says, what is the theory implied in such rituals as those of the Goetia? What does the magician do? He applies himself to invoke a god, and this god compels the appearance of a spirit whose function is to perform the will of the magician at the moment. There is no trace of what might be called machinery in this method. The exorcist hardly takes the pains of preparing a material basis for the spirit to incarnate, except the bare connection of themselves with a sigil. And this we see in a lot of offhand ritual practice where someone doesn't even go to the bother of preparing an entire temple or a material basis. They just prepare sigil as if it is just the sigil that will work. Now it can do that, and we've looked in a previous video about making a sigil work, but Crowley is after something far more important with this. It is apparently assumed that the spirit already possesses the means of working on matter. And this is a major mistake. It's like when people ask me about the Holy Guardian Angel and the Abramelin work. Most people assume that the Holy Guardian Angel has any interest at all in one's material life, one's everyday life, money, wealth, health, any of these things. I can assure you the Holy Guardian Angel does not have any knowledge, capacity, interest or comprehension of such trivial matters, of such limited matters. And so therefore, even though the Abramelin does have all of the magical squares, you'll notice they're for things like flying, becoming invisible, drowning your enemy's ships in a harbour and so forth, because of various reasons, but it is not because once you gain the knowledge and conversation and develop the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel that you can or are even interested in performing simple, as most people would call them, everyday rituals. You can, and one does, but it is not the be-all and end-all. There is no necessity after that point. There's no necessity to do one thing over another other than one's true will. And so therefore, the attention given to that is from a perspective of not having done it and being in an erroneous, argumentative position to it, rather than afterwards when you see everything in a very, very different way, because that is the nature of that particular experience and ritual, and that's what it's there for. It is apparently assumed that the spirit has the means of working on a matter. The conception seems to be that of a schoolboy who asks his father to tell the butler to do something for him. In other words, the theory is grossly animistic. The savage tribes described by Fraser, that's J.G. Fraser, and I think Crowley's referring to the Golden Bough, had a far more scientific theory. The same may be said of witches, who appear to have been wiser than the thaumaturgists who despised them. They at least made waxen images identified by baptism of the people they wished to control. Obviously, Crowley's definition of a witch varies from time to time, and it's got nothing to do with how we might see it these days. They at least used appropriate basis for magical manifestations, such as blood and other vehicles of animal force, with that of vegetable virtues, such as herbs, i.e. through correspondence, which again we've looked at as being very important in magical work. So, they were also careful to put their bewitched products into actual contact, material or astral, with their victims. The classical exorcists, on the contrary, for all their learning, were careless about this essential condition. They acted as stupidly as people who would write business letters and omit to post them. And this is really where the magical link is forged, that it has to be earthed. Our rituals of the 12 signs that we practice in our Order of Everlasting Day, based on earlier zodiacal rituals that we once practiced in the Illuminated Congregation of Melchizedek and the Mart Network, they worked powerfully, and we had to warn people before embarking on the process that they would, because they would change people's lives substantially, because they were earthed, because we ensured that they made a magical link between their intent, their so-called magical practice within the temple, within the ritual, and their actual lives. That their actual lives became the zodiacal rituals, were part of the zodiacal rituals, and when someone would said, oh, I can't get to the ritual this week for this month's ritual because of this has happened, and this has happened, it was like, yes, that is the ritual. You are in the ritual now. And that's one good thing about the film A Dark Song, where it shows not just a version of the Abramelin ritual and the knowledge and conversation of the Holy Guardian Angel, but it shows how real magic changes one's reality so that you're inside the spell, that you're inside the ritual, and there is no escape when you're inside proper magical work. As Crowley said, that your oath had to stay the same throughout, no matter what else changed. It was always a trick, a distraction to break you from your magical intent that you're doing the ritual. And you think you're not doing the magic, and that's when the devil tricks you. It's sort of like you look down and you're standing outside of the circle, and you take a step back and you realize that the devil only just put the circle there and you've just stepped outside of your actual circle. No matter what happens, you do not move once you've set off, and that's the purpose of the magical link. And interesting enough, if you go back to Chaos Magic, look at Liber Null, look at P. Carroll's ideas for magical formula, you'll see something equivalent baked in to that formula. Even though the formula doesn't actually work, it doesn't really measure magical practice. There's a flaw in the actual maths of it, but it is an attempt to actually make a model of magical work and make it understandable to some extent. And Crowley is really talking about that from experimentation. And that's why even later on in his life, when he comes to Magick Without Tears, that he is still trying to tell people, look, I wrote this decades ago and it's still the most important thing, and people still haven't read it, is chapter 14 on the magical link. People are too busy arguing whether Crowley was a black magician or not, or whatever they might argue about, without actually reading some of the hard, gritty stuff. And I hope these videos are helping us break those open so that we can get some of the really actual interesting stuff from long-term practice, as opposed to, as they say, something racy for the gulls that might attract people in the first place to the occult and to Western esotericism. So Crowley goes on to say and complain that there's been a failure to understand magic, but Eliphas Levi did talk about it and talk about the power of the astral light. And then he goes on to talk about the astral light. But then, more importantly, and again, you can see these are in bold, and this is a useful thing, the universe is a projection of ourselves, an image as unreal as that of our faces in a mirror. Yet, like that face, the necessary form of expression thereof, not to be altered, save as we alter ourselves. The mirror may be distorted, dull, crowded, or cracked, and to this extent the reflection of ourselves may be false, even in respect of its symbolic presentation. In that light, therefore, all that we do is discover ourselves by means of a sequence of hieroglyphics, and the changes which we apparently operate are, in an objective sense, are illusions. And I think Crowley is making the important point that people only half make when they talk about the universe as a mental experience, an experience of the mind, and therefore no definitions matter other than the ones I'm about to give you, that the mirror exists, and we exist to be aware of the mirror, and in effect the mirror is aware of itself. And so the reflection, that self-reflective, I am aware of myself, therefore I do exist, I have memories of myself, therefore I do exist, is just the act of looking in the mirror. And all ritual is, and all life is an inquiry into where is the mirror flawed, where is it broken, where is it different, what is the state of the mirror itself. And that is reality. And he talks about the quantitative laws as are much less dissimilar from those of material physics, and magicians have too often been foolish enough to suppose that all classes of magical operations are equally easy. 1 day is with the Lord as 1,000 years is their first law of motion. Faith can move mountains, they say, and disdain to measure either the faith or the mountains. If you can kill a chicken by magic, why not destroy an army with equal exertion? Or with God all things are possible. And he's pointing out that magicians, as opposed to actual magicians, assume or never question, or they don't care about reality and the ratio of effort to result of the state of changes that you can make with existing states as they are. And he talks about this absurdity is an error of the same class as that mentioned above, and so forth. Then he talks about making a talisman and changing history, and now he talks about thelema and religion and the fact that the magical link has to be made, so that it is no use to write a manifesto of change to tell everyone how you're going to vote or whatever it might be. The only important thing is that you vote and that you encourage other people to vote, but you actually take them and watch them vote, and the job is done. And it is irrelevant how you get that done. The important thing is that you don't confuse talking about it, arguing about it, being distracted about doing it, other than the actual act itself. So Crowley talks about the fact that, for example, the talisman and the circle and so forth are all part of everyday life. And he talks about how different religions have grown as a result of that. But he goes on to say, this is an extreme case, but there is one law only to govern the small as the great. The same laws describe and measure the motions of the ant and the stars. In every operation of magic, the link must be properly made. The first requisite is the acquisition of adequate force of the kind required for the purpose. We must have electricity of a certain potential in sufficient amount if we wish to heat food in a furnace. And he goes on to talk about, it is therefore absurd to invoke the spirit of Venus to procure us the love of an empress, unless we take measures to transmit the influence of our work to the lady. We may, for example, consecrate a letter expressing our will, or, if we know how, we may use some object connected with the person. And there's going back to, I guess, a sort of primitive form of associative magic and so forth, and through correspondence. But for material ends, it is better to have material means. We must not rely on fine gut in trolling for salmon. Our will to kill a tiger is poorly conveyed by a charge of a small shot fired at a range of 100 yards. Our talisman must therefore be an object suitable to the nature of our operation, and we must have some means of applying its force in such a way as we will naturally compel the obedience of the portion of nature which we are trying to change. So here Crowley is talking about the talisman isn't just making a sigil in your temple, that if your talisman is about communicating something, you should communicate it as well. If you are doing a ritual to find a job, then it is far better to consecrate as your talisman your job application letters. It is far better to invoke courage in yourself with the cameo of Mars or the Olympic talisman or sigil of a particular entity, god form or whatever, and have it carry it around so that you can hold on to it when you enact the thing that you are doing, like going to talk to strangers, a group of strangers to make friends or whatever it might be, that you are actually sticking your courage to the mast and actually holding it at the time. This is how things get done in magic, in actual magic. It is no use just sitting in a makeshift temple with a sigil and then not actually applying yourself in the real world to do it. That's just escapism. As I sometimes say, it's a bit like getting an escape map in your cell and then just using it to wallpaper your cell so that it just looks a lot more comfortable and you've got a lot of pictures of where you want to escape to. It's far better to look at the map, eat the map, and then enact the escape plan itself. And you are escaping into reality, not out of it. So Crowley goes on to this, and he talks about the things like the bouquet, chocolates, a little dinner, a whip, moonlight, a poem, as all being possible talismans of a love spell, for example. And he's got some tongue-in-cheekness about, one can point out the broad distinctions between women who yield, some to flattery, some to eloquence, some to appearance, some to rank, some to wealth, and some to authority. And he gives the appropriate talismans, I guess, for each of those types of person, as Crowley sees it at least. And then he says that the magical link may be classified under three main heads: one plane and one person, one plane and two or more persons, and two planes. So he's really saying that there are different levels of working, magical working, to do depending on what you're trying to actually achieve, and with objects outside of your own control, and even persons outside of your own control. For instance, one may wish to obtain the knowledge put forth in this book. Not knowing that such a book exists, one might yet induce someone who knows of it to offer a copy. Thus one's operation would consist in inflaming one's will to possess the knowledge to the point of devoting one's life to it, in expressing that will by seeking out people who seem likely to know what is needed, and imposing it on them by exhibiting such enthusiastic earnestness that they will tell the inquirer that this particular book here will meet your needs. So Crowley is seeing it on three levels. There's your action, the action you're putting out, in which plane you're putting it out, in the everyday world, in the astral world, and so forth, and other people or other objects that you're trying to influence or attract and work with in order to achieve that thing. And these three things need to have a magical link that exists between them. Again, going back to the zodiacal rituals, the rituals of the 12 signs that are going to be republished next year in 2025 at the time of this recording, the important thing about those was to earth them in everyday reality for the whole year and keep that consistent, unyielding, and that's why they work to effect such major changes in people's lives, and why it's still working every day for some of the practitioners. Crowley goes into a lot more detail about these three worlds, but then let's take another look at one of the highlighted things, which is useful to read through first in any of the sections in Magick. So when he's talking about creating storms, for example, it says, "Now they, as a person, cannot pray to God to cause storms, for the gods are but names for the forces of nature themselves. But as a mystic, they know that all things are phantoms of one thing, and that they can be withdrawn therein to reissue in other attire." Now, this is one of the key things in this whole book, buried here. As a mystic, they know that all things are phantoms of one thing, and that they may be withdrawn therein to reissue in other attire. That you can change the clothing, the appearance of one thing to another, because it's the same thing. But you have to draw it from one place to reissue it in another place. And there is no threefold law or karmic retribution or anything like that. There is literally only, it's like the law of conservation of momentum. You can literally, or entropy, you can literally only take and give to the same amount. And this is what Crowley actually referred to as witchcraft, when all you're doing is changing the appearance of everything for no good reason, not to serve your will, just because you think you can. And there's no aim to that, there's no ambition to that, there's no journey in that. That's a very limited form of magic, which Crowley called witchcraft itself, not witchcraft as we understand it now. So that's really important to understand, that when you are trying to do something, that you are, of necessity, sacrificing something else. And Crowley sees that as equilibrium, not as justice, as he changed his tarot card from justice to equilibrium. And there is a sense of understanding that in order to get magic to work, if you are going to try for something big, you are going to have to lose something big, give up something big, or change something big. It's as simple as that. The laws of magic, as Crowley is saying, are not outside the laws of nature. We are trying to understand the laws of nature more by understanding magic and its part in actual reality, not trying to divorce ourselves into an entirely illusionary view of the universe that doesn't even work. And he picks up on this. All such magic demands the utmost precision in practice. It is true that the best rituals give us instructions in selecting our vehicles of force. In 777, we find correspondences of many classes of being with the various types of operation, so that we know what weapons, jewels, figures, drugs, perfumes, names, etc. to employ in any particular work. So again, he's talking about 777. The Book of Correspondences, you can see mine has been done to death, all of the pages are falling out, but ultimately one learns all of the correspondences so that you can apply them in real time, all of the time, as part of everyday life as an actual magician, as opposed to a magician in a temple. In practice, the magician must evoke the spirits of the storm by identifying themselves with the ideas of which atmospheric phenomenon are the expressions as his humanity is of him. Thus achieved, he must impose his will upon them by virtue of his intelligence and the integration of his purpose to their undirected impulses and uncomprehending interplay. He's talking about a magic spell, a weather spell, and the first weather spell I ever did was cycling on the way to my first initiation, which was going to take me 3 hours to cycle to where I was going. And I lit a candle as a clever beginner witch, although by then I was just turned 18, and I thought I understood how to make it work, so I did it. I think it was a red candle to Michael or something, going back many years now. And the weather cleared. It was incredible. I managed to get there for the ritual, did the ritual, was initiated into Gardnerian witchcraft. Then I had some social time and then set off back. And of course, about just after I turned away from the house where I was initiated, and it poured it down. It was a torrential downpour. The entirety, I've never ever been so wet in my entire life, not even swimming in an ocean or anything. I was just drenched and then drenched again consistently, cycling with all of the lorries going by and everything else. And of course, all I'd done was move the weather pattern from one time space to another time space. And it served my purpose. I didn't want to get to the ritual for this important moment in my life to be absolutely drenched or uncomfortable. And I had a cloth rucksack with my robe in it and so forth, so I didn't want that to get wet, and so on and so on. So all I did was manage to move time space, but I didn't change the actual event or the energy of it itself. And Crowley is talking about this in this section. He says, we see then, and another of the bold things that is highlighted here, we see then that we can never affect anything outside ourselves, save only as it is also within us. Whatever I do to another, I also do to myself. And this is another part of why the magical link and this whole chapter, chapter 14, is so important. It teaches us things that are real, that are part of being an actual magician. So he begins to conclude, there's thus some justification for the assumption of previous writers on magic that the link is implicit and needs no special attention. Yet in practice, as an actual magician, there is nothing more certain than one ought to confirm one's will by all possible acts on all possible planes. The ceremony must not be confined to the formally magical ritual. We must neglect no means to our end, neither despising our common sense nor doubting our secret wisdom. Then he ends, let the magical link be made strong. It is love under will. It affirms the identity of the equation of the work. It makes success necessity. And so this is why chapter 14 on consecration is so important to actual magic. And Crowley had written it way back when he wrote Magick in Theory and Practice, or Magick, book 4, in this section of the consecrations. And it was so important that later on, when he wrote Magick Without Tears, in letter 64, he refers, you must lay to heart Magick chapter 14 and never forget the detail of the magical link. The one technical point on which I insist above all others is the magical link, says Aleister Crowley. Not the Goetia, not Enochian, not sex magic, not sigils, not anything else, but the magical link. Applying your life to magic and applying magic to your life, and in the right relationship, in the appropriate ratio to accomplish the great work, which is your true will. And this is what Crowley is talking about, and this is what I like to talk about within these videos and within our books as well. So if this is of interest to you, stick around for the next video, and I look forward to seeing you there. And until then, as ever, the worker is hidden in the workshop.